Hi, this is Thomas Goss, and today we're going to talk about texture, balance, and function. Texture, balance, and function. That's my way of describing the three essential elements that comprise a good orchestration. Too many beginning orchestrators nowadays compose as if instruments were synth patches. Basically, things are just completely unlimited, and instruments go here and there, just without any regard to the actual ability of the players to play those lines. And what ends up happening is the music ends up sounding like it was composed on a synthesizer, even when it's played by real instruments. Or it ends up being too much effort with too little result. The players are just killing themselves to play your piece, and it just ends up really not sounding all that great. Sometimes there will be a huge understanding of the individual instruments and what they're capable of doing, but then the person will turn out a score that is completely unbalanced, and you won't be able to actually pick out the individual elements. Everything will just be sloshing together. Sometimes I will hear a piece of orchestration by a student that is very technical and has great musical merit, but the textures are pretty uninteresting, or they're very derivative of other things. The thing to understand is that orchestra is made up of living people. Okay, they're all working together as a whole. A well-orchestrated piece is in touch with this, and reveals the orchestra to be functioning like an organism. So my goal in getting you to think about texture, balance, and function is to bring out what is natural and live about the orchestra. Is the vertical aspect of this formula, and it's basically what is going on simultaneously with all of the instruments at once. What is the character of that sound? What is the color of that sound? It's something closer to color than to landscape, but there is another feature of this formula that refers to landscape, which we'll get to in a second. Think of it more as color. What colors are you creating when you combine the instruments together? That is so important, and that is a fundamental aspect of creativity, of orchestration. It's almost like you're being a painter. But don't think of it just as a scientific cross-section of the orchestra, just 1 second in time, just sliced out of the score and stuck under a microscope for you to analyze. Don't think that way, because texture has got a time element built into it. Music is about time, after all. So, and how it changes over time is also very interesting. People oftentimes, especially in a score by a young orchestrator, there's a tendency to take a texture and then just draw it out for long minutes, and to sort of create a sensation of wonder in the audience. But I have to say that is really overdone. What's more interesting to me as sort of an old-handed orchestration is how does the character of the music, how does the color of the music change over time? Okay. So that's pretty important to me as an orchestrator now. Balance is the second aspect of this formula, and I've written right here, balance is the dynamic and timbral relationship between the instruments that allow the functions of each part to be clearly heard. Okay? So a badly balanced score, you will bury the important part. And sometimes you'll have a score where everything is up front and everything is exactly the same dynamic level. And, it's incredibly hard to hear anything. It's hard for the ear to pick out what's important. That is part of your job, okay? As a texturalist, in our previous segment, you are responsible for creating the color of the orchestra. Now, in terms of balance, you are more akin to a landscape artist, okay? I want you to think of balance not as just a seesaw, okay, of like this sound is louder and that sound is quieter, because that's not the way your ears work, okay? You have 2 ears and you listen in stereo, okay? And when you are listening to a well-orchestrated piece and you're sitting right in the center of a really good auditorium, you are able to hear the orchestra in front of you. You're able to see where the sounds are coming from, what is their dynamic level, what is the relationship, and all this other stuff. So when you are creating a balanced score, I want you to think of the landscape. I want you to think of mountains, of valleys, of the listener's ear sort of being exposed to this wonderful landscape that you are making for them. You have to think that way in order to balance all of the elements, I think, and to be a good orchestrator. Certain things come out of the mix, certain things rise, just like a mountain or a hill, and the relationships to each other, high to low, loud to soft, and also the timbres. It's not just loud and soft. Is something more nasal, is something more silky, is something more strident, is something glaring, is something really, really discreet. It's not just the colors of texture, but it's also the interrelationships of the different instrument. So whereas color sort of gives us a texture that can sort of move us in one way, balance, I find, is the one that brings out the emotions in the audience the best. Okay, our third element, function, is the musical role which each part plays in the orchestra, whether it's a section or an individual instrument. It's the horizontal aspect that I was talking about before, and here's where horizontal continuity comes into play. Remember, a few segments ago I was talking about a well-written part having an element where it was satisfying for the musician all the way through. But that just all ties into the whole definition of function. What is the function of each part, over time? Here's where more technical things like part writing comes into play, which is sort of the tasteful, semi-contrapuntal way to put a score together. Okay, I'm not going to get into part writing in this series because I feel that that is musicianship, that's musicology. Okay, I want to focus on orchestration. I don't want us to get distracted. But just, for all of you music majors out there, this is where that whole element of counterpoint comes into play. The function of each instrument is a good way to separate out what is going on in the score. You might look at a whole sea of notes, but once you realize that several instruments or groups of instruments are doubling each other, and that particular function is to say, hold down the bass line, or to create arpeggios which are of interest and sort of provide a counterweight to the melody, or which instruments are playing the melody, or which instruments are playing a counter melody. How does that counter melody affect the texture and the balance of the music? All these things are interrelated. So, why bother? Who cares? What's so important about learning to think of orchestration as texture, balance, and function? First of all, it can help you to define the roles that you're assigning to each instrument, and that way you can avoid cliches, which are, all too frequent, especially in film scoring nowadays. You can train your ear to recognize textural elements a little bit more precisely, and then, of course, preventing off-balance scoring is so important. Sometimes you just have to hear around the playback option on your notation program, whether it's Finale or Sibelius. My own sense of what is actually happening in the score is very strong because of my sense of balance and my sense of texture. Okay? So thinking in terms of balance, texture, and function helps you to think around, to hear around your notation playback. Once you get used to this formula, you find that you can apply the thinking just sort of automatically to different things, like to an individual part. What does the part contribute to the texture? How is it balanced against the other parts? What's its function? And then thinking of the entire score simultaneously, like what is the overall texture of each episode, of the entire score, of the entire movement? How do the instruments balance and interrelate to create the texture? How is the function of the music being accomplished by this arrangement? And so apply that to your own scores and see if there's any way that you could improve things just thinking in that way. All right, and I'd be happy to hear from anybody who's got some comments about it.